So I remember I was in therapy a few years ago, and my therapist asked me if my family was close. And I think I responded, we were about average close for white people. Because I've noticed that certain ethnic groups, they tend to have much closer families. I'm thinking about Asians and Jews in particular. But white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, I think they're about the only group that doesn't live through their children, which is a wonderful thing that parents aren't trying to live through their kids. It was a wonderful thing that my dad did not try to live through me, and my mother did not try to live through me. On the other hand, Protestant families of Northern European origins tend not to be as closely knit as, say, Jewish and Asian families. I've been thinking about the book It's Never Too Late to Have a Happy Childhood, and translating that into perhaps it's never too late to have a happy relationship with your father. So my father died about 2 months ago. He died March 11, and we were not close. And we really did not have much of a relationship from about 1994 on, but we didn't really have that close of a relationship prior to then. But what about this idea? It's never too late to have a happy relationship with your father. And so I think that means that you think about the good memories that you have, more you give them more emphasis than the bad memories that you have, and that you expand your own level of empathy for your father. You take a little effort and put yourself in his shoes and try to understand the world as he saw it and understand what he was dealing with. And when you do so, you can develop more empathy for him. And by having a kinder view of him, you can perhaps in your mind reconfigure a kinder relationship with your father. Just thinking out loud. So many people see my father as heroic, and my sister certainly sees my father as heroic. This is one of the greatest men who ever lived. And so over the past 2 months, I've been reading a lot of tributes to my father or analyses of my father. And that's helped me to grow in putting myself in other people's shoes, understanding my father as they saw him. It's very hard for any man to be a hero to his son. And it's very hard for any man to be a hero to his valet. And it's an interesting process, kind of coming to terms with my father. He was 90 years of age when he passed, and I just wanted to read something that I found on AdventistToday.org. Des Ford rests. Can Dr. Ford rest too? So Clinton Jackson writes, I was born a few years after Glacier View, and I grew up in Currumbong, that beautiful melting pot of all that is Australian Adventism. I grew up in Currumbong too. At Avondale College, I lived there from age 6 to 11. Growing up, I always sensed that there was something amiss in our community of faith, something hidden from discussion, a secret everyone knew but that was off limits. Could have been a forbidden treat from which the adults drew solace, or an unacknowledged wound that threatened to turn septic at any moment. In either case, it was something we did not talk about. Slowly, though, pieces began to come together. Words like judgment, assurance, year day, 1844, sanctuary works, Daniel, Hebrews, grace, controversy, consensus, and estrangement. I began to realize that we were dealing with a mythology, one much greater and carrying more weight than could be shouldered by one man alone. Yet at the center of it all was a man, Des Ford. And looming larger than life was a figure, Dr. Ford. Des Ford could preach. Des Ford was electrifying. Des Ford was knowledgeable. Dr. Ford was encyclopedic. Des Ford was an honest seeker. Dr. Ford was unrelenting in his quest for truth. Des Ford was compassionate and gracious. Dr. Ford was a victim of unjust political machinations. The mythical Dr. Ford lived in the shared consciousness of the Adventist village, while the now retired Des Ford swam and wrote and received guests at his home in Queensland. So I've heard from people that after Jesus, Des Ford was the most talked about person in their home. So he definitely had a mythic and heroic role for thousands of people. I saw it for myself one afternoon, hundreds packed into a community hall in Thornley to taste or retaste that which seems to have been forbidden. My friend, whose father had driven us, and I were by far the youngest in this room full of nostalgia and regret. For my part, I was amazed at Des Ford's oratory, the speed and ease with which he answered questions, and his detailed replies without reference to his notes, which remained in the Bible closed in his hand. So I remember when I was growing up, I'd meet people and sometimes I'd bait them by saying, "Well, what do you think of Des Ford?" And sometimes they'd say a lot of really negative things. And then I'd say, "He's my father." And then they felt embarrassed. I guess I enjoyed that kind of sucker punch. Not long after this event, there was a letter with stern instructions to all Seventh-day Adventist ministers. Dr. Ford, the letter said, was not to speak from our pulpits. Tithe had been solicited and received, they accused, and only the letter writers could receive tithes. So tithe means, it's an Old Testament concept that you should give 10% of your income to charity. And so Seventh-day Adventists, by and large, give about 10% of their income to the church. So the church was very concerned about people instead sending their tithe to my father's non-denominational evangelical Christian foundation, Good News Unlimited. So a lot of these disputes, they have a theological component, they have a political component, they have a personal component, and they have a monetary component. So by my father forming his own Christian organization, thousands of people donated to him money that they would have otherwise sent to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Animated by this new injustice against Dr. Ford, letters of protest were drafted and redrafted. Offers to accept him as a member were extended after other congregations told him he wasn't welcome. A steely determination to have inaccuracies corrected and progressive iterations acknowledged led to multiple clandestine gatherings across the village, referring to Avondale College. But the protagonists of the Dr. Ford story did not realize they wanted and needed something much deeper, much more personal than a doctrinal concession. In late high school, I wanted to know more, and to know why, I went in search of answers. I don't remember the answers, I remember the tears. Our minister sat in our living room and tears, yes, tears streamed down his face. A grown man, 20 years later, still visibly moved by past hurts. How had it come to this? So, by and large, Protestants of Northern European heritage don't tend to cry much in public. Northern Europeans tend to a stiff upper lip, very different from the more emotional peoples of the Middle East and Africa. So there was very little public crying I saw in my childhood. But when my father left the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there were a lot of people who cried publicly for the first time in their lives. He was not the only one. A family friend described it to me as the single most traumatic event in his life. I remember his words were something like this: I lost friendships, I lost colleagues, and it was the death of the illusion that the church was interested in truth. So in my father's final testament, he wanted to make clear to everybody that he had lived his entire adult life in pursuit of theological truth, and that he'd always primarily been motivated by theological truth. Now, I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist. I eventually converted to Orthodox Judaism, where I now reside. And I find this talk of theological truth pretentious, because all theological truth depends upon a leap of faith, which contains a great deal of subjectivity. And when you multiply anything by zero, referring to subjectivity, you get zero. So to me, it's silly to argue, get upset, and to upend lives over theological truth. speaking here to individuals. Obviously, movements and organizations have to stand for something. They have to stand for what they understand as theological truth. So, in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, for example, Christians were killing each other over Christian dogma, over whether or not something was theological truth. I'm much more comfortable in the world of the Orthodox Judaism, where the religion was 3,000 years old before a rabbi came along and cataloged what a Jew should believe, before Judaism had any systematic theology, before Judaism developed a dogma. And Maimonides created a formulation of the 13 essential beliefs. But every single one of these 13 essential beliefs, you can find a great rabbi disagreeing with parts of it or all of it. So theology does not play a big deal in Orthodox Judaism. I don't think I've ever had a rabbi ask me what I believe about God. Okay, when I was converting to Judaism, they wanted to know, how do you prepare tea on the Sabbath? They wanted to make sure I knew Jewish law, but we didn't spend much time discussing theology. On the other hand, that was what obsessed the home I grew up in. People were crying and changing their lives and losing friends and leaving community all over theological arguments, which seemed silly to me. A debate over celestial room allocations caused this much hurt. Surely there was more to this story. It was supposed to be kept quiet, but we all showed up anyway, emboldened perhaps by the proximity of retirement. A pastor was flouting the letter of prohibition. An invitation to Dr. Ford to preach was issued and accepted. Although 74, so that's 16 years ago, Des Ford was still dynamic and inspiring and grace-centered. Everything this community in Charlestown needed to hear. As the questions and answers rolled that afternoon, I could feel this community slowly breathe out. They were healing. So when you breathe in, that tends to be energizing. Like you take a lot of breaths in, you get energized, and when you breathe out, that tends to be relaxing. So this was closure for them. Toward the end, a young American pastor stood. I never understood why my professors never taught past Daniel 6. I now know why. On behalf of all the young people in our church, I am so sorry about what happened to you and your family. So I was part of that family. It was devastating to me when my father left Seventh Adventist Church employment. I went from being part of a close-knit community to being outside in a much colder world. Sorry. If only it had been said earlier and said more often. For my parents' generation, Dr. Ford, by name or otherwise, was one of us, and he was all of us. The injustices and hurts of that era were their hurts, their losses, and their grievances. The Des Ford story became their story, through which much grief and frustration with the church was channeled. The church they loved and worked for, served for, and defended became the antagonist in their personal stories. They wanted a church that was gentler, kinder, more receptive to the needs of people, more human. But unable to move past the hyper-cognitive strictures of our denomination, they debated kingdoms and verbs and calendars and types and anti-types, piling up reason and logic in the hope of some doctrinal concession, but never asking what they most yearned for, the simple words, "I'm sorry." Des Ford now rests. He has the peace that sometimes eluded him. But Dr. Ford lives on even for my generation. We see the pain, we have witnessed the hurt. Wounds that are needlessly ripped open by tone-deaf leaders for whom pastoral care is always secondary to doctrinal purity. And we wish our experience were different from that of our parents. We wish the church, the one that we love, prioritize people over policy, kindness over being right, equality over compliance. We've been shortchanged by post-Glacier View teaching. We've been assaulted by strident and often thin theological voices and have had to search for the richer, deeper theological voices. Most significantly, we have inherited a spiritual legacy of hurt and pain, a legacy we want to heal. So we cling to hope for a better church and a better world. We linger in our shared disappointment through which healing slowly but certainly must dawn. And we look to Jesus, our Redeemer, our Sabbath rest, our sanctuary. That's the end of this essay by Clinton Jackson, who's a graduate of Avondale College and is now a high school physics teacher. So I want to play a video. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. This is Jerry Wise from Family Tree Counseling. It's one of my favorite YouTube channels. So I'll just play a little bit of this.
Outside of Indianapolis, Indiana. I see clients in my office and online. I have over 100 free videos on YouTube and sharing some important topics from a family systems perspective, which I think is a very healing and helpful perspective, and what a lot of people don't find a lot of these days. If you've read books by Harriet Lerner, The Dance of Anger, The Dance of Intimacy, she also has ascribes to the family systems perspective. And there's some other authors too, Jenny Brown, Andrea Shera, and we all share the same basic theoretical understanding of relationships. And in my own past, in getting a master's degree in marital and family therapy, that was the predominant perspective that was offered. And I think it's been a really healing one for me as well as for other people. Today, my video is entitled, "It's Never Too Late to Have a Happy Childhood." So Jerry, what do you mean by that? I'm not a child anymore. I'm an adult. How am I going to have my childhood over again? But just because you're no longer a child does not mean that that child no longer exists. The child exists within you. And we call that child in you the inner child, or our inner child.
So on April 26, 2013, I wrote a blog post which I put into draft mode instead of publishing. I just wanted to keep it available to myself, that at a future time I could publish it, such as after my father's passing. So I'll read from this. I'm reading the book, The Father Factor, and I want to do an exercise from it. Dad, I forgive you for not getting the help you needed for your own stuff. You therefore couldn't help transmitting to the rest of us your anguish and anxiety. You had parents who neglected you, and therefore you were never able to be affectionate. I have no doubt that you loved me, and I have no doubt that you did the best you could, and you always aimed for upright behavior, but you are uncomfortable with emotion, and you're fundamentally ill at ease with yourself and with others. You avoid emotion as much as you can, and that has left me struggling with how to deal with emotion. You're not demonstrative and affectionate. You're not comfortable with saying, I love you, unless you're on a stage in front of people. Your inability to deal with emotion and to let people around you know that you love them left me feeling worthless. I've battled all of my life with a deep feeling of worthlessness. Much of the time, I feel like a horrible person. I forgive you for infecting me with your own high levels of anxiety and self-loathing. I forgive you for not seeking the help you need. God is not enough. Your own life proves that, Dad. I forgive you for putting your career ahead of my well-being and my best interests, Dad. I forgive you for needing to be the center of attention everywhere we went. Dad, I forgive you for your insatiable need to stir up controversy so that you could have people talking about you. This constant tension in the home, everywhere you went, was not in our best interests. But you're in the grip of your own emotional addictions, and you are not willing to seek help. Dad, I forgive you for having a total block at learning anything from me. Dad, I forgive you for your inability to have a normal conversation. Your primary interest is in giving instruction rather than creating emotional connection. Dad, I forgive you for your inability to share much with me about your life beyond the pro forma. Dad, I forgive you for having a need to control so great that you would try to distort the reality around us by denying what was really happening in our home so that we could keep up appearances. Dad, I forgive you for speaking for me so often and not allowing me to say what I feel and to own my own reality. If I feel you had to speak up and let everyone else know I was okay, even if I was in great pain and wanting to speak for myself. Everything else is a minor detail. Hmm. So that was something I wrote in 2013. Still working stuff through. Right. So let's go on to chapter 5, this excellent biography of my father, Desmond Ford, reformist theologian, gospel revivalist. It's available, I believe, from the Adventist Today website. Terrific biography by Milton Hook. So this is 1961. Back to Beloved Avondale is the chapter title. Any qualms Dr. Ford had about leaving America were compensated by the joyous expectations of returning to Avondale College to teach theology. For years, he had climbed the mountain toward this goal. Now there appeared a plateau. Anticipating a smoother run, he was unaware the decade would be a bittersweet ride. Leaving Michigan, Des and his family went to San Francisco to board the ship for Australia. Before embarking, they stayed briefly at the denomination's Pacific Union College to the north of the city. Des took the opportunity to talk with Graham Maxwell, a resident theologian. During the discussion, Maxwell freely admitted there were serious problems with traditional Seventh-day Adventist interpretations of the books of Daniel and Hebrews. It was Christmas time. 5-year-old Ellen, that's my big sister, and 3-year-old Paul were delighted to discover some gifts left at their door by Ivan and Phyllis Higgins. The Higgins family had recently returned from a stint of service at Avondale College. These parting gifts were in keeping with the American thoughtfulness and generosity received during the 2-year term of studies. So I can also say, someone who grew up in Australia, that American generosity has never ceased to amaze me and inspire me. It's pretty awesome. On the high seas, there was time for reflection on class preparation for the coming year, and more importantly, prolonged hours of family togetherness. For Alen especially, the trip was full of treasured memories with father in hand, sharing his cabin, exploring the ship, and indulging in cherry pie and cream for breakfast while mother and Paul were still asleep. We took pineapples back to the cabin for them, but no cherry pies, she confided later. The Fords took up the residence on the Avondale College estate, as was expected of all lecturers. Their weatherboard cottage was located near the little cemetery dubbed God's Acre. Habitually, Des woke about 3 a.m. to study and write. So when I was growing up, my father would typically rise about 4 a.m. Only, I think, when it got into his 60s and 70s did he start rising a little later, perhaps closer to 5 a.m. Then he cooked a hot breakfast, or at least had the veggies in the oven for the family before they finished slumbering. So yes, that's my memory. My father would always prepare us a hot breakfast, and he would often squeeze fresh orange juice for us. It was just often bring it to our rooms when it was time to get up, and we'd start the day with some freshly squeezed orange juice. After each meal, Des and Gwen went for a 20-minute walk hand in hand. My dad was a big believer in going for a walk after a meal, that the exercise would help the digestion. Acting on Ellen White's advice, the children did not attend school until they were 8 years old. I think my brother actually was closer to 10 years of age before he began school, which placed him permanently behind, both academically and socially. And he never really overcame that. And he ended up leaving school, I think, at about age 15. I think he experienced that as a great disadvantage. So I don't think that's good advice. I did not begin school until I was 8. So I also felt kind of permanently behind things, particularly socially. So the social skills that other kids were picking up by going to kindergarten at age 5 and first grade, age 6 or 7, I was lacking those skills, so I always felt a little bit behind socially. So I don't think Dad did us any favors by waiting till we're 8, 9, 10 before we entered school. And my father was acting on Ellen White's advice, which I don't think is good advice. Family worship with scripture and prayers followed. Yes, we did that every morning, every evening. Didn't particularly enjoy it. Then Des went off to classes while Gwen remained to read stories to the children. With no television in the home, both parents found time to read stories to the kiddies for several hours each day. So I think that was of great benefit to my life that we did not get a TV till I was age 14. So in 1980, when I was 14, my father was preparing a defense of his controversial theological views, and he wanted to get a TV for the first time to calm down during this period of great stress. So my father liked to watch the old classic movies, and he also liked to watch the news. And then I got my parents to watch Mary Tyler Moore Show, MASH, Hogan's Heroes, Cheers. I didn't watch WKRP in Cincinnati with my family, but yeah, I got them into watching some of those shows. Jungle Doctor books and Pilgrim's Progress were favorites well beyond the age when Elaine and Paul could read for themselves. Des and Gwen often reached the end of a book only to hear read it again and then go back to the beginning once more. So I really love Audible. No, I didn't watch Benny Hill with my parents. You're a sick man. I really enjoy Audible, getting books on Audible. I love being read to this day, hearing books on tape, books on my phone, because I think it brings back good memories of my parents reading to me so much. So it feels very nurturing to me to this day to listen to books being read to me. Parenting, of course, was not easy. Elaine readily admits she was often argumentative and forever testing the cautions of her parents. So my big sister, Elaine, was the most challenging child to raise. I was the easiest. And then after I turned 18 and got into my 20s, I became the most pain-causing child, the most difficult child. My brother, the middle child, Paul, he was kind of the overshadowed one, the silent one. On one occasion, my sister backchatted, became sassy with her mother, who sent her to Des in his study. Tried to explain to her how it hurts parents deeply when children misbehave. I don't believe you, she said scornfully. Then, instead of spanking you, Des replied, I want you to hit my hand as hard as you can so you will understand how it hurts me. He held out his hand. I cannot hit you, she stammered through her blubbering. But you must, Des pressed. No, I will never hit you. Des tenderly reached forward, took her by both hands, and she fell into his lap, sobbing. The spirit of love in the home was palpable. I started a blog about air supply. Let me see if I can find my air supply blog. And Air Supply Forever. Is that I think that was the name of my blog. And in it, I wrote that there wasn't much love in my home. And I really first felt love when I started listening to Air Supply in 1979. My father was very hurt by this blog post of mine. So here, I'll post a link in the chat. So I wrote this essay in March of 2005. When Russell Hitchcock and Graham Russell met on May 12, 1975, during the first day of rehearsals for Jesus Christ Superstar, I was not yet 9 years old, living 2 hours' drive away in Currumbong, the home of the Seventh-day Adventist Avondale College, where my father, Des Ford, was the chair of the religion department. My home was not a happy place. After my mother was diagnosed with cancer on my first birthday, my family cracked up. Though my dad remarried 9 months after her death and I got a devoted stepmother, the love had left our home. What remained was my father's dedication to saving souls for Christ. Aside from that, this world was worthless. Popular music was not allowed in our home. It was regarded as a sin, along with caffeine, nicotine, and sex before marriage. My parents, along with most of the Christian world, regarded Jesus Christ Superstar as sacrilegious. While Graham and Russell toured Australia and New Zealand with this musical, they started singing Beatles hits together, as well as a couple of Graham songs. The Beatles, according to my dad, were satanic. So Graham recalls, we made a demo of 2 of my songs, Love and Other Bruises and If You Knew Me. The demo was recorded live on a cassette in the orchestra pit using the drummer and pianist from the show. We shopped it around Sydney with no luck in an environment of AC/DC and rock and roll. As a last resort, we saw Peter Dawkins from CBS. He loved the sound he heard. We made a single in 4 hours at Albert's studio on King Street in Sydney. We didn't have a name yet, but that night I dreamt of a billboard with a flashing neon light, and on it said Air Supply. The single came out and was played on 2GB radio station in Sydney. Not long after, it was all over every station in Australia. It went to number 1. In late 1976, Air Supply opened for Rod Stewart around Australia. In May 1977, my parents and I moved to Pacific Union College in the Napa Valley. Lost and lonely, I immersed myself in books of history. Music was a minor part of my life. My parents liked certain hymns, mainly those composed by Martin Luther, John Newton, and Paul Wesley. And my father adored the 19th century German classical music composer Wagner. On July 4, 1977, Air Supply boarded their first 747 and flew to Los Angeles. They toured with Rod Stewart, around North America for 6 months. Back in Australia, Graham wrote future hits Chances, Lost in Love, and All Out of Love. One Sabbath afternoon, October 28, 1979, my father denounced our church's central doctrine of divine chosenness before 1,000 of his co-religionists. Soon after that, he was called to account for his heresy at Seventh-day Adventist headquarters in Washington, D.C. Just before my parents left, a classmate I envied for his popularity, Andy Muth, was pushed by his mother to invite me to his home for Sabbath lunch. It was the first time in America that I'd been invited, without my parents, to a friend's home for a Sabbath lunch. The meal was life-changing. For a few hours, I sat with a family who loved each other. My own home was cold. I hated it. Constantly dreamed I'd be adopted by a loving family. Yet, whenever I went through the specifics, I always concluded that the benefits of my home outweighed the disadvantages. My father lived by the dicta that great people discuss ideas, not people. Our table talk was about philosophy, history, and my father's theological battles. Ordinary matters such as girls were forbidden. Not explicitly, just by my father's stern example, which my stepmother generally fell in with. The one time in 7th grade, a girl called for me at my home. My mother answered the phone and I got into trouble. I remember my mother running down the driveway saying, "Luke, who's Jeannie?" Jeannie was my kind of quasi inklings of a girlfriend in 7th grade. My dad was far tougher on my older siblings. I didn't like to make waves around the house than on me. I got the kinder, gentler, older Dr. Ford. When my brother was 13, my dad marched to the door of his girlfriend's parents and broke up the relationship. By age 15, my brother and sister had left home. My father was uptight around women. He thought they were, in general, overly emotional and insufficiently rational. Resolutely moral, Dad hated it when they tried to hug him. He loved misogynistic remarks from unimpeachable sources, such as the one by Martin Luther that women were born with big hips so that they can stay at home and sit on them. As I grew up, I found myself mirroring Dad's behavior, shrugging off the female touch, even though it was what I wanted most. I had this gorgeous 7th grade teacher, and I really wanted to be touched by her. But whenever she'd put her hands on my shoulders, say when she was looking at my work, I would flinch. From age 8 on, I was fascinated by girls and by sex. Due to the standards of my home, it was not something I could talk about except with my closest male friends. When the first girls became interested in me in 5th grade, I punched and kicked them, I spat upon them, and I left thumbtacks on their chairs for them to sit on. I didn't know how else to respond to what I wanted. Now on this Saturday afternoon, the Sabbath afternoon with the Muse, sat with a family who could banter about all my secret fascinations. chiefly the cute girls in my class, such as Denise Bernard. When my parents moved to Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks later, I stayed behind with friends and became close to Andy and his family. Though the Muse had the same religious code as my parents, there was humanity in the way they implemented it. For the next 5 years, their home was an oasis of normality for me. I was never happier than when I lived with them. One Sabbath, they even had Denise over for lunch. Andy introduced me not only to beautiful girls, but to the typical concerns of 13-year-olds, such as computer games and pop music. In early 1980, Air Supply's title cut, Lost in Love, went to number 3 on the American charts. I immediately latched onto the group because their music spoke to my lonely heart. I loved their first hit because it spoke to the way we can inspire each other. But I'm back on my feet and eager to be what you wanted. All Out of Love was their second hit. I'm lying alone with my head on the phone, thinking of you till it hurts. I know you hurt too, but what else can we do? Tormented and torn apart. I wish I could carry your smile in my heart. The times when my life seems so low. It would make me believe what tomorrow could bring when today doesn't really know. Doesn't really know. As a kid who moved a lot and tend to romanticize what I'd left behind, this song spoke to me. Then came the Air Supply hit, Every Woman in the World. Overnight scenes, dinner and wine, Saturday girls. I was never in love, never had the time, in my hustle and hurry world, laughing myself to sleep, waking up lonely. I needed someone to hold me, oh, oh, oh. It's such a crazy old town, it can bring you down till you run out of dreams. So you party all night, the music and lights, but you don't know what happiness means. I was dancing in the dark with strangers, no love around me, when suddenly you found me, oh, oh, oh. Love can transform your life, not just love of a woman, but love of friends, of text, of experience. Felt that if I could tap into the power of love and combine it with a disciplined commitment, I could transform my unhappy life. The One That You Love was the title cut from Air Supply's second album. It became a #1 hit in America. Well, the night has gone away. Doesn't seem that long. We hardly had 2 words to say. Hold me in your arms for just another day. As one who had never spent the night with a girl, that description sounded thrilling. Here I Am was another hit. Here I am, playing with those memories again. And just when I thought time had set me free, those thoughts of you keep haunting me, holding you. Feeling I never outgrew, though every part of me has tried. Only you can feel space inside. There's no sense reading. My heart is mending. I admire the urge of the lyrics. They would be written. Again, never get enough in Japan. Begin. Now you're gone. All lying here in the moment of your year. Never asked back. My hair. Long as night of fallen to you, because when I'll be just right now, and the sweet, I'm the night band thing. Oh, wait, the right. I want direct when she looks at me, I know the girl sees things nobody else can see. All of the secret fears inside and all the craziness I hide. She looks into my soul and reads me like nobody can. She doesn't judge the man. She just takes me as I am. And there's Even the Nights Are Better. You knew just what to do because you had been lonely too, and you showed me how to ease the pain. And you did more than mend a broken heart because now you've made a fire start. So Two Less Lonely People in the World was the wedding anthem of the 1980s. Just to think what I might have missed. Looking back, how did I exist? I dreamed. Still, I never thought I'd come this far, but miracles come true. I know, because here we are. And there was Young Love. Take my thoughts away beyond the things we see. And don't know why there's a additional Luke Ford in the chat, but here we go anyway. Then there's the song Making Love Out of Nothing at All. Every time I see you, well, the rays of the sun are all streaming through the waves in your hair, and every star in the sky is taking aim at your eyes like a spotlight. The beating of your heart, of my heart, is a drum, and it's lost and it's looking for a rhythm like you. You can take the darkness from the deep of the night and turn it to a beacon burning endlessly bright. I got to follow it because everything I know, well, it's nothing till I give it to you. So yeah, I'm desperate to do great things for the girl that I love. It was the next Air Supply song, I Can Wait Forever. When it looked as though my life was wrong, you took my love and gave it somewhere to belong. I'll be here when hope is out of sight. I just wish that I were next to you tonight. And though I'll be reaching for you, even though you'll be somewhere else, my love will go like a bird on its way back home. Okay, let me know how the sound quality is now. Okay. I Can Wait Forever. I just did that, just as I am. I've had a lot of big dreams. I've made a lot of bad moves. I knew you could walk away, but you never do. I've met a lot of cold hearts. I've learned to smile and deceive. I know I'm hard to be around, but you never leave. Okay, sounds back. Good. Then there's The Power of Love. We're heading for something, somewhere I've never been. Sometimes I am frightened, but I'm ready to learn the power of love. So during the first 6 months of 1980, when my parents were gone in Washington, D.C., when I'd go to bed at night, I'd tuck a radio under my pillow, and for the first time, I'd listen to the same songs and the same music that my classmates listened to. All right, I want to play a little bit more here from Jerry Wise. It's never too late to have a happy childhood.
Our outer body has grown up. Our inner body, feelings, our mind, our beliefs, our patterns, may be scarred, wounded, suffering, and abandoned since our childhood. And we've never dealt with those. And so that inner child still has those wounds. They haven't been healed and had good parenting and those kinds of things. And I don't care if you're 72 years old, or 94 years old, we can still suffer from things we experienced when we were 11, especially if we have not dealt with them, or resolved them, or healed them, or we don't understand the importance of loving self and becoming a better parent to yourself. Sadly, some people go to the grave with very wounded inner child issues which haunted them their entire lives. The good news is you don't have to. So, Jerry, how can I have a happy childhood now? I'm 45 years old. I'm 55 years old. I'm 37 years old. I'm 29 years old. How can I have a happy childhood? I can't go back and relive that. So what do you mean by that? What I mean is this. Our little child is still inside of us, reacting, overfeeling, overreacting, or feeling safe, or feeling fearful, or feeling loved, or feeling shamed, or abandoned, etc. Often as adults, we have been trained to ignore these feelings.
So as you can tell, I've had 10 years of therapy, quite immersed in therapy speak and healing the wounded inner child. So during the day, now 8th grade, freed from my parents. I was able to mix normally with people. I developed friends and community. I touched girls. It was cool. Remember back in the beginning of sixth grade when I first came to the United States, the most beautiful girl in the class, Cindy, dropped a note on my desk asking me if I wanted to go with her. So with an opportunity to seize love, accept love, and to give love, I froze. I felt unworthy, and I never answered her directly. Instead, I teased her unmercifully for months. When I finally dropped a note on her desk and asked her to go with me, she responded with an enthusiastic no. But now in eighth grade, away from my parents, I learned from my classmates' example of how to express what I felt in more socially appropriate ways. Instead of dunking girls in the college pool and twisting their nipples, I began holding them in ways that they wanted to be held. At times even got to touch the most beautiful girls. In the main, however, found myself longing for one particular girl. Denise did not feel the same way about me. For months on end, I called her every day till the gossip went around the class about what I was doing and how annoying she found it, and humiliated I got the message and I quit. But I couldn't quit loving her. She was the first girl I asked out on a date. Several times she turned me down in the summer of 1981 between 9th and 10th grade because she had to go to horse shows. Finally, she said yes when I asked her to a San Francisco Giants game. It was the first night of professional baseball after a 50-day players' strike. I was so nervous that I wore mismatched socks and spent most of the nights making bets with my friend Andy. Denise and I never went out again. I hear she's now married and living in Los Angeles. Later in the summer, I fell in love for the first time with a girl who reciprocated my feelings, Rainey Jackson. She was a year younger than me. She had chubby cheeks. We liked the same music. It took me a year to work up the courage to kiss her. Meanwhile, when I left the Muse to return home, Rainey and I exchanged long and loving letters, far longer and more longing on my part. However, till the time I got so jealous when she said that she'd gone to a Journey concert with a college guy. I stopped writing to her for several months. Nothing is more effective with girls than cutting off attention to them. I remember she wrote me back talking about how hurt she was. The most haunting Air Supply song is Chances. Whenever I heard it, I thought about Rainey. There's a chance you will be there, wondering what to do, how to play my role. I'll leave it up to you. If I disguise my smile, it gives too much away. What if we can't speak? What then shall I say? Don't you be too long. Something has gone wrong. The chances are all gone. From childhood to adulthood, I found it hard to approach someone I'm attracted to, especially when I'm feeling unworthy, which has been much of the time. And I find it easier to sit in the corner and sulk. I found it easier to avoid painful truth and to live in fantasies and delusions of grandeur. Found it hard to tell a girl that I care about her. Not only does that make me incredibly vulnerable, but it gives her all the power and removes from me all the mystery. It's a really lousy strategy, unless you're sure the feelings are mutual, or you need to get clarity on the matter so you can fish or cut bait. Air Supply articulated my helpless longings and soothed the pain of my awkward adolescence. My favorite songs included Chances, The One That You Love, Here I Am, Sweet Dreams, Even the Nights Are Better, and Two Less Lonely People in the World. Andy not only introduced me to junk culture, but also to junk food. We'd clamber into the bins outside our local supermarket and dig up the pastries and cookies that were a day or two past their expiration date. I was also introduced to the trash can outside the post office, where one could find catalogs of pornography. I wouldn't look at it for religious reasons, but I got a thrill from hanging out with those who would. I'd ask them to describe to me what they saw. After high school, I created my own life. I didn't need Air Supply as much, and it was a good thing as they were all out of hits. My new favorite song is 1984's Drive by The Cars. Who's going to tell you when it's too late? Who's going to tell you things aren't so bad? You can't go on thinking nothing's wrong. Who's going to drive you home tonight? Who's going to pick you up when you fall? Who's going to hang it up when you call? Who's going to pay attention to your dreams? Who's going to plug their ears when you scream? I listened to that song while driving home Rachel, a 16-year-old I fell in love with during my year back in Australia, 1984-85. Because of a miscommunication, her mother thought the host of a party I wanted to take Rachel to was someone else, a different Sue Scott, and forbade her from going. I never got to date Rachel, All I got was the privilege of driving her home one night, then a week later, taking out her twin sister, Leanne, all night. I never saw them again. In the early 1990s, Rachel died in a car accident. By the time I lost my virginity at age 22, 21. I'd moved from popular music to classical music, though I was willing to play that REO Speedwagon tape, High Infidelity, to get my girlfriend in the mood. Since then, I've limited the amount of discretionary time and money I'll spend on pop culture, and I concentrate on things more in accord with lasting values. 1999, 2000, and 2001, I took long drives from Los Angeles to my childhood haunts. When I stepped alone onto those familiar paths, all of my friends have married and moved on. I realize how little I've changed. Yes, I've learned to control my behavior better, but the same forces that drove me as a kid to seek sanctuary in Air Supply still drive me today. And when my fears and hopes hit peak intensity, and I'm as lost in love as I was at age 13, nothing speaks to me like Air Supply. Music takes me back 25 years to my adolescent fear and excitement over girls, when I no longer feel that shock and awe that I will worry. As long as I have passion, I can still make my dreams come true. And one day soon, I pray I will be one of 2 less lonely people in the world. So some girl read my blog and started writing to me, and so we'd correspond and talk on the phone. We had Air Supply in common, but that was about it. Well, here are some of the comments posted on my blog. I too love Air Supply and have ever since the first time I heard All Out of Love when I was 7. In my heart, there has never been a song written that can top how that one makes me feel when I hear it. Even at 7, I started my journey to find the one who I couldn't live without. The man I fell in love with and married, we have 2 wonderful children, doesn't even begin to understand how Air Supply moves me, and he tends to make fun of me. In fact, we were married for 7 years before I realized that I even listened to Air Supply. Alas, I've yet to see them in concert. He will not let me go with a friend, and yet when I plan for him and me to go, something always comes up and we have to cancel. But hey, they're still out there, and there's always that little glimpse of hope. Stand strong, Air Supply fans. There's more of us than anyone thinks. And this Brazilian goes, I'm a Brazilian girl, and my music is lonely as the night. And she gives her email address. I should like to have Air Supply friends. So I finally got to see them in concert. It was something like 2004. And I was, 2004, how old was I? I was 34. I was 38 years of age. And I was dating someone who was 24, an economist. And we were fighting a lot because she wanted to break up with me because I was writing about the porn industry at the time. And I think this was one of our last dates. So we drove down to San Diego for the Air Supply concert. And she'd never even heard of Air Supply. And she said it was the first concert she'd been to where people weren't up and dancing the whole time. Said everyone was seated. So these 2 guys come on stage and they're in their like mid to late 60s. But yeah, it was pretty awesome finally getting to see Air Supply. Okay, I'll play a little bit more here from Jerry Weiss. It's never too late to have a happy childhood.
And ignore our inner child. People often deny this internal experience by saying, well, that's just nonsense, Jerry. I'm totally responsible for my own feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And I don't need to take care of some silly inner child. And I believe growing up with my family, the past was the past, and I don't have to do anything about it now. That was then, this is now. Though of all the people who have said that, I've always found that they end up coming around and accepting the fact that, maybe I didn't resolve all those issues from childhood. Now, I don't believe in going back and dealing with family of origin stuff, because there's just no reason for that. I don't want to blame my parents. My parents are, as though that's what I'm telling them to do. They need to blame their parents, which is not what I'm talking about. Nor am I talking about blaming anyone. I'm talking about understanding what it was like to grow up in your family. Understanding is not the same thing as blaming. And I'm totally responsible for my own feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. Except what I find is those people who say they're totally responsible for their own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors have thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that they have some kind of uncontrol over. They get reactive. They get sullen. They become overreactive and angry, distant, cold, critical, mean, weak, lost. All of the things a child can feel when you're growing up. And they don't attribute that to childhood. They attribute that to their adult situation today. Only what's interesting is they feel angry to a 10, but the situation warranted a 1 or a 2. My belief is the 2 through 8, the 2 through 9 gap is what's our inner child that we haven't healed or resolved. Or they feel lost. Well, why do I just feel...
Okay, so this story went out on Wireless Flash in May of 2005. So Wireless Flash goes to all these different radio stations looking for guests. LA man needs woman to celebrate air supply anniversary. You're a smart, funny woman who is free on May 12. A man in Los Angeles wants to take you out on a date, as long as you like the 1980s soft rock group Air Supply. May 12 marks the 30th anniversary that Air Supply members Russell Hitchcock and Graham Russell started a partnership that created hits like Lost in Love, All Out of Love, and Every Woman in the World. One person particularly touched by the band is an Australian journalist named Luke Ford, who says Air Supply songs articulate what he feels about love but rarely experiences. He wants to honor the band's anniversary by taking a woman out to a vegan restaurant and a walk along the beach while engaging in meaningful conversation with no distancing devices. Ford hopes the experience revives his romantic side, which he says has been dormant ever since a woman reprimanded him for sending flowers too soon in a relationship. Ford hopes the woman is attractive, but says more than 15 pounds overweight is not a problem. No, I said no more than 15 pounds overweight. Jay Massive, right? Just because he's a vegan Air Supply fan looking for love on a message board about Air Supply, oh yeah, damn, he is a loser. And I reply, I'm not a loser, I'm a highly respected journalist. Corey writes, this is pathetic. This guy is using any excuse to whore up his career and try to get his hands in a vegan gal's pants. And then I got a comment on my blog. Hi, pal. I found your blog accidentally. It's amazing how two different people can have such similarities in their thinking. I am a devoted Air Supply fan who lives on the other side of the world in the most dangerous place to live, Baghdad. I'm an Iraqi, Gemini, and a writer too, although my official job is a dentist. I like your blog. I have to admit, Air Supply meant a lot to me as a teenager. They guided my steps through to maturation. And then Air Supply fan says, to all the people out there who trash Air Supply, perhaps it's more, if more music of their type was still on the airways, we wouldn't be going through the crap we're going through now. Majority of today's music is aggressive and demeaning to the human race. We shared love and emotions instead of singing of killing and effing your best friend's girl. So on, perhaps our younger generations would grow up with respect instead of drugs and guns. Okay, on the same blog, I write about the void inside. I have this big emptiness inside that I'm always trying to fill by blogging about myself, self-publishing books about myself, Googling my name every week, checking Technorati daily for any reference to me, checking my email every 5 minutes, posting on chat boards to get a reaction. Just realized how empty my life is by emailing somebody who I expected had spam block, and I found myself thinking, good, I know I'll get a reply because I'll get that automatic reply from a spam blocker. One of the things I hate about pitching an article is that half the times I do it, I get no reply. When I do get a reply, it tends to come after a week or so. I so hate rejection because my own sense of worth is so fragile that I rarely pitch editors with stories, and I rarely ask out women I'm interested in if I think they are too beautiful or too good for me. Jedi Knight comments, you're putting yourself in a weak position here. It's good to know your own limitations, but never tell the whole world about them. Okay. Part 2, what air supply means to me. Air supply inspires me to lead a life in accord with transcendent values. Life is relentless and we need inspiration as we trudge along. For many years, air supply gave me such inspiration. Their lyrics articulated what I felt, but I could rarely say, except in that rare relationship or in therapy. Air supply gives me a taste of the transcendent. As with all those who articulate a higher way of living, they are easy to make fun of. I've been told that my essay on air supply was the first non-cynical thing I've written in a long time. So if I were to live in fidelity to Air Supply's lyrics on their 30th anniversary, I'll have to be genuine for longer than 5 minutes, be emotionally honest and courageous. I admit that to speak with the honesty of Air Supply's lyrics would be inappropriate most of the time, even with your girlfriend or wife. It's too much. But Air Supply articulates what I've often felt, and even if it wasn't right most of the time to give voice to such feelings, made me feel better that somewhere someone else had done that on my behalf. Then next entry on my Air Supply Forever blog. In the true world, love isn't found on the radio, it is found among the people. But for those of us with strongly misanthropic drives, particularly when we were younger and dumber, the sweetest love we knew was on the radio. Remember that Donna Summer song? Someone found a letter you wrote me on the radio, and they told the world just how you felt. Must have fallen out of a hole in your old brown overcoat. They never said your name, but I knew just who you meant. I was so surprised and shocked, and I wondered too if by chance you heard it for yourself. I never told a soul just how I've been feeling about you, but they said it really loud. They said it on the air, on the radio. Whoa, on the radio. Okay, May 12, 2005. How to observe Air Supply's 30th anniversary. It's May 12, Yom HaAtzmaut, or Israel Independence Day, working on an essay about Air Supply's meaning to my life. In honor of their contributions to music, I want to have a meaningful date on that day. Failing that, I will spend the sacred time writing about love and other bruises. To give in to moral weakness would be to betray Air Supply's ideals. Therefore, I will not hook up May 12 with some girl young, dumb, and full of fun. Okay, just some references to Air Supply. I think once I got into 12-step work for sex and love addiction, my need for Air Supply type music considerably diminished. Okay, back to Jerry Weiss. It's never too late to have a happy childhood.
I feel lost. I just need to grow up and be a better adult and be more mature. Well, but there's something in your way. And what may be in your way is your inner child that you're not doing anything with and still treating as badly as your parents treated that inner child. All of these feelings, the distance, angry, critical, mean, weak, etc., all of these feelings have roots in our childhood. Healing our childhood can help us have a happier childhood as an adult, because that child remains until the day you die. Do you want that child to have a happier childhood? Let's have a happier childhood now. Even though I'm not 15, I'm not 12, I'm not 8, I know that. I'm quite aware of that. As I get older, I know I'm not young anymore in that way. But there's an inner child in me, and what am I going to do to parent that inner child in a way that would be loving, caring, accepting, things that I may not have felt from my own parents. And again, I mean, your inner child never goes away. You never stop being the 5-year-old, the 11-year-old, the 15-year-old. It's just that the 5, 11, and 15-year-old don't rule your life. I hope they don't. I hope the adult part of you rules your life. If you remember transactional analysis from a long time ago, they talked about 3 subpersonalities. One is the critical parent, the second is the adult, and the third is the child.
Okay, back to the biography of my father, Desmond Ford, reformist, theologian, gospel revivalist. So the spirit of love in the home was palpable. So I didn't usually experience that. My father was deeply hurt by that essay I shared with you a few minutes ago. But I experienced my home generally as a pretty cold place. But of course, I can go back and I can remember the warm times and the loving times and the fun times. And I can choose to focus more on those than on the cold times. Spirit of love in the home was palpable because both Des and Gwen possessed even temperaments. I really tried the patience of both of them to the limit, my sister Elaine recalls. I only remember my father losing his cool on one occasion. He was upset to find my brother and me listening to music he thought was inappropriate. So my father got very angry when my brother and sister were listening to Puff the Magic Dragon. My father was convinced that this was drug music, devil music. Got very angry listening to Puff the Magic Dragon. Sobering memories like these were overwhelmed by recollections of the frequent times of laughter. Des loved a joke, often spontaneously clapping his hands or slapping his thighs with boyish delight. Des was frequently called on to preach at local church services and to conduct meetings at SDA camp sessions both in Australia and New Zealand. These often took him away from his family or reduced his holiday time with them, but he always sent letters. My father did always send letters, but his handwriting was so bad I couldn't read them. I'd always turn them over to my stepmom to read them for me. On one occasion, the family went north to holiday in Queensland with Gwen's parents. He had to remain behind to take meetings at the local Araring campsite. He wrote to 6-year-old Elaine, I have thought about you much since I left and missed you and Paul and Mummy very much. You remember Mr. Walter Kilroy? I'm sure you do. Sent a present along for you. Today he told me that your talks with him made him feel very happy inside. Isn't it wonderful that we can, with Jesus' help, use our words to make people feel happy? So I was always impressed with my father's ability to counsel people. Even as a teen, and may not have been terribly impressed with my dad, but I'd see people with wrenching problems come to him, and by the time they'd walk out after their counseling session, they had considerably increased serenity and clarity. Another time, Des was conducting meetings in Adelaide, South Australia on Gwen's birthday, but words of endearment were worth more to them than gifts. Before he departed for Adelaide, he had left an envelope addressed poetically to Miss 32 to be read April 22nd. Inside, the note read in part, a better wife no man has ever had. Now our union is the sweeter year by year, although our program continues to be a busy one. I hope the kiddies will always remember, as I do, your untiring devotion to we 3 other family members. God bless you, dear, and give you a happy birthday and many happy years to come. So my father definitely did have a romantic side and a loving side. Gwen was the untiring home anchor, a spiritual and practical right hand for Des. She loved to grow vegetables and flowers. Des himself tried his hand at it, but he says he gave up because callers continued to drop in and hinder this backyard exercise. Family's version has an added spin. Story is told that one day Des took the spade and with great gusto turned over sod after sod in Gwen's newly planted corn patch, burying most of the seeds so deep they rotted in the ground. Time would tell, however, that his gardening skills would improve. Actually, I don't think my father's gardening skills ever improved. Currens Road, that's where I grew up at Avondale College. Think of something like 212, 220 Currens Road. It was a fact, however, that the frequency of visitors who wanted to mull over minor theological questions became unmanageable again, just as it had been when living in Kurrumbong in 1958. For that reason, 18 months after arriving back from America, Des found a home away from the campus on Currens Road, more off the beaten track, but still within walking distance of the classrooms. So I grew up on Currens Road, about a mile, mile and a half, 2 miles from Avondale College campus. Gordon McDowell, as college principal, liked to have all his lecturers living on the estate. The move to Currens Road was therefore met with some initial resistance from him, but he acquiesced graciously. It irked him, however, that Des got into the habit of avoiding attendance at evening meetings, gatherings, which teachers were expected to be present in those days. Des, of course, being such an early riser, saw bedtime about 8 p.m. Des was never a handyman, that's true, although he did excel himself with some maintenance work on the unpainted house at Currens Road. My father was not practical at all, once falling off the ladder and knocking his head on the concrete. Soon after arriving on the college campus, Des bought a second-hand motorbike and sidecar. There were many close shaves, his daughter remembers, when he'd be thinking of his next sermon instead of concentrating where he was driving. He would often drive the family the short distance to Beauty Point for a swim. So my father was very much the absent-minded professor. He would struggle to remember his kids' names because he was thinking so much about theology. He'd sometimes call me Ellen, which is my sister's name, or Paul. He'd go, Ellen, I mean Paul, I mean Luke. His mind was elsewhere. And so women often complain that men can't remember private conversations and details. Well, that's because men are usually thinking about how to make a living. So if men weren't thinking about how to make a living, then they'd have more brain space left over for those sort of intimate details. Back to Jerry Weiss's talk, it's never too late to have a happy childhood.
PAC, parent, adult, child. And those three subpersonalities are at work in us all the time. And we talk about that child personality as being the inner child. And, you know, if there's not been too much damage to the inner child or to the child part of you, and if the parents weren't too critical or too negative, too problematic or toxic, then there's a fairly good balance between those three. If not, then we have some real problems to deal with. And a lot of adulthoods, a lot of people who reach adulthood have suffered a lot of inner child wounds. And they're adults, but they suffered child wounds when they were growing up.
Okay, that's Jerry Weiss talking about it's never too late to have a happy childhood. Okay, it's never too late to have a great relationship with your dad. Family's recreation also included camping trips to the Watagan Hills within sight of the college, just as he had done in his student days. They rode 2 bicycles loaded with a tent, supplies, and the 2 children. Later, when Elaine got her own bike, Des would tie a rope to hers and pull her up the hills. They would find a spot to pitch their tent and then enjoy long hikes. Des also bought a heavy old rowing boat from a local and would take the family down Dora Creek to Poolbar Island in Lake Macquarie. They hiked over the island, counting the venomous red-bellied black snakes in their travels. So I was always afraid of the red-bellied black snakes. They were deadly, dangerous snakes all around where I grew up. And 2 cents says Luke's dream the day his father passed was one of the best dreams. Can't think of anything other than cliches to what it was moving. Thank you. So I'm making a playlist for all my streams about my father. I started that stream about 20 minutes after finding out my father had died. I first called my stepmother in Australia, talked to her for a few minutes, and then wanted to talk to you. When it came time to eat, Des waded out into the lake up to his waist and scooped up some clean water to make a stew. He had a tasty recipe that pleased the family. Before rowing upstream for a home on one trip, they all had to sit out some stormy weather, huddled in the tent, listening to their little radio to the likes of Puff the Magic Dragon? I don't think so. My father regarded that song as representing drug music. Later, when the motorbike was pensioned off, Des bought an old Peugeot car. Family ventured south to Canberra in it during one holiday, traveling back via Wollongong and up the Bulli Pass. The engine groaned and wheezed all the way up the steep and winding track. Periodically, Des pulled to the gutter, allowing the long line of trapped drivers behind him to pass. During rainstorms, Gwen had to manually operate the windshield wipers so that Des could see the road ahead. Their hapless fortunes with old motor vehicles continued, generous students sometimes passing around the hat to keep the wheels underfoot. So I think my parents did not get their first new car until something like 1981. I've never had a new car. Even at Currans Road, some people persisted by dropping in for a theological powwow. Often at mealtimes, the entire Ford family decamped to the bush for privacy. And students, if they needed to ask questions about their classwork, were encouraged to visit before classes began at 7:30 a.m. Could the Fords be branded as antisocial? No, on the contrary, their congeniality attracted villagers and students alike. On occasions, entire theology classes were invited to a breakfast of gem cakes, muesli, and apples. Des's recreation included swimming with some teachers and students. I know at least one occasion my father was swimming with a student, and the student got a bad cramp, and my father had to rescue him and pull him to shore. My father often repeated that saying by Jean-Paul Sartre, "Hell is other people." So I do think my father had elements, at least, of an antisocial personality. It was vital, however, that time be jealously guarded. Des had a full teaching load and was appointed to a number of committees, including the division's Biblical Research Committee. My father hated committees. My father did not like working collaboratively like his younger son, and was a popular speaker at youth gatherings and camp meetings. So incessant were calls for Des to address church members in Australia and New Zealand that Lawrence Naden, who had succeeded Francis Clifford as division president, had to instruct his subordinates to restrict their demands. After all, he reminded them, Des Ford has more than a full-time job at the college. Des also had publishing commitments to fulfill. Continued his Bible question corner in the church paper. On Sunday, he typed out 15 pages to mail away to Robert Parr, the editor. The welcome checks that came in return from Parr were usually accompanied with the advice, don't spend it all on lollies. Lollies is Australian slang for candy. In the classroom, Ford was scintillating. He fired like a Gatling gun. Delivery was never extemporaneous. On the contrary, he prepared each lesson, and by the time he stood in front of his class, he was able to recite it from memory. Only occasionally would he dash a word or two on the blackboard, and students hardly had time to scribble notes. They got the gist and caught the enthusiasm. Not that they'd be able to read his notes very clearly. My dad had very poor handwriting. His teaching strategy was to set a tough exam for the end of the first term to, he claimed, improve the students' productivity in the remaining 2 terms. When my father transferred to teach at Pacific Union College in California, said he had to halve the coursework that he assigned, that American students were slack compared to Aussie ones. Generous college administrators initially allowed anyone to sit in on Des's classes, including some adults from nearby Currumbong Village. Eventually, as the scramble for seats edged out paying students, a stop was put to this practice. His style was in sharp contrast to the dreadful droning of some other lecturers who labored through their handwritten notes or complex blackboard schemes. Des inspired his students to read the books he recommended. They followed in his footsteps, accepting the same principles and precepts. His enthusiasm for biblical classics was infectious, and one student became a part-time dealer by importing from a second-hand bookshop in Wales. If his students get time to read all the books on his list, they would leave college with an excellent library for personal study and further intellectual growth. McDowell was impressed with the results. The life and teachings of Jesus class, he noted, converted many to a genuine Christian experience. Whenever Des was off campus on speaking appointments, he attracted more young people than any other lecturer to the idea of attending college. Student numbers grew rapidly and classes filled quickly. So my father was like a rock star in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. In Seventh-day Adventist Church, the biggest stars are the charismatic and dynamic preachers. I'm going to skip the sections on theology. There were two further concerns for Des in the 1960s. One was his wife's deteriorating health, and the other was a developing covert operation mounted by traditionalists against his teachings. Almost as soon as Des set foot back in Australia, George Burnside began a censorship campaign. Increasingly, Burnside found himself edged out of the campus meeting pulpits because Des preached a more appealing message. Only on rare occasions was Burnside asked to speak at Avondale. College President McDowell was not a Burnside devotee. These matters seemed to irk Burnside, and when he realized Des was still advocating the new view about Armageddon and the King of the North, he publicly belittled Des during meetings with other SDA ministers. The students who were trained at Avondale carried Des's views into their own pulpits. One intern was reprimanded because he used the word eschatology in a church service. Older ministers with little more than a high school education hadn't heard the word before and took offense, accusing the young man of bragging about his undergraduate training at Avondale. Rumors were circulating also. The college students were no longer believing in a literal sanctuary in heaven with two separate rooms and golden furniture. Someone in Kurumbang village, thought to be Raglan Marx, circulated an anonymous letter calling for something to be done to arrest the apostasy at Avondale. Ichabod, he decried, should be written over the old chapel, or perhaps better still, placed up on the principal's TV antenna, which was the first in this Adventist community. So traditional Adventists don't like TV, don't tend to own TVs. Think of TVs as cesspools. He huffed and puffed against the Bible department's teaching that the earth could be more than 6,000 years old, and then put his sword into Des. Dr. Ford, he concluded, would now have us believe that the heavenly sanctuary is only an object lesson with no real articles of furniture. In fact, it does not even have walls. In other words, there is no sanctuary in heaven. Rumors continued swirling, encouraged by snide remarks from leading evangelists such as John Connolly in Victoria. He was known to point northwards to Avondale's theology department and say with a sneer, the King of the North, a biblical vandal against the saints, is up there. Matters were brought to a head in 1969 when Burnside was preaching near Kurumbang. He made a thinly disguised jab at Avondale, saying heresy is being taught at an institution not far from here. So I'm going to skip the theological controversies. The many burdens that Naden's letter mentioned no doubt concern the deep anguish over Gwen's deteriorating health. 1963, Gwen was diagnosed with malignant breast cancer and underwent surgery. There was every hope of a permanent recovery, but it proved to be false. The deadly specter of fatality returned about 4 years later when I was 1, on my first birthday, and her brave fight for survival assumed epic proportions. Her natural timidity left her and an inner resolve took over, but the cancer spread to her bones. Simultaneously, the family was in the process of moving from Currans Road, the lakeside suburb of Silverwater. Des, Alan, and Paul often pedaled their bikes the 8 miles to and from the campus for classes. That's 8 miles each way. If Des needed to arrive early or the weather was inclement, he drove their old combi van before dawn, taking a hot breakfast for the kiddies to eat along the way. He would leave the vehicle at the footbridge across Dora Creek, the back entrance to the campus. Traveling in the winter months was most uncomfortable. Des found that his fingers and feet remained frozen even after arriving in the classroom. He tried pepper in his socks as a desperate remedy. Gwen was confined to bed much of the time. Charles and Ruth Bird had reunited and settled nearby. Ruth baked savory dishes for the Fords and sometimes did their laundry. Des did the grocery shopping and frequented the secondhand shops in Newcastle hunting for clothes. As Gwen grew progressively worse, she could not keep her food down, vomiting and retching repeatedly. Elaine and Paul emptied the bowl, counting 20 to 40 times each day. Dehydration became a problem. Des often stayed awake at night, listening to ensure that she was still breathing. The ambulance came many times to take her to the hospital for intravenous feeding and a little recuperation. The older children did what they could to help, especially caring for infant Luke, who had been born in the Sydney Adventist Hospital in 1966, I believe in Kurri Kurri. If Luke cried a lot at night, Elaine and Paul often pushed him along the dirt road in his stroller, ducking for safety behind bushes when the headlights of a car appeared. Early one morning, when Luke was a toddler, they wheeled him in the stroller to a nearby jetty, still clad in their pajamas and slippers. They took turns gathering handfuls of stones for him to throw into the lake. When their backs were turned momentarily, he toppled into the lake. Elaine dove in, clothes and all, to fish him out. By the time Elaine started high school, which I think is grade 7 in Australia, she had learned to assume a supportive role beyond her years. So this can lead to the complex where you take care of everyone else but yourself. So if in childhood you were forced to take responsibility beyond your years, it's not uncommon to grow up with the same tendency and to always be thinking first about taking care of others, and therefore your own batteries get run down. Besides caring for Gwen and little Luke, she often took Paul by train into Newcastle for shopping trips. They sometimes stayed briefly with Gwen's half-sister who babysat Luke. Des and Gwen learned that a doctor practicing up north near the Brinsmead family was using some new treatment for cancer sufferers. In desperation, they agreed to try it. Most of the medical profession could only offer Largitol to limit the vomiting and antibiotics to guard against infections that might further debilitate her body. It was a two-edged sword, for the antibiotics weakened her immune system. Experimental and natural remedies seemed to be the only avenues left. So as my mother's suffering with bone cancer, which really turned my father against the medical profession. My father just had this deep hatred of doctors. He would often say that most things either cure themselves or they can't be cured. In other words, that doctors are useless. Though when I became really sick in 1988, they did send me around to doctors and try different things. Of course, nothing worked. And I had this deep fear, suspicion that nothing my parents suggested would work, which was accurate. Finally, I met a Jewish woman who took me to her psychiatrist, who got me on a medication that did completely turn my life around. And Soram wonders if I ever thought of changing my name. Well, my Hebrew name is Levi ben Avraham. So many people in Orthodox Judaism call me Levi instead of Luke. I've never thought of changing my name on my driver's license. In January 1968, so I would have been 18 months, Gwen went north to stay in the Brisbane home of a friend. A month later, she transferred to the home of Lawrence and Verna Brinsmead because she needed Verna's nursing skills on a daily basis. Children stayed at John and Carleen Brinsmead's farm. It was not long before Len chose to remain with Gwen, taking Luke with her. So I think it was on the farm that I think my brother was forced to chop the heads off of, I don't remember if it was chickens or kittens or whatever it was, but the Brinsmead thought it would toughen him up. A couple of months later, they both returned to their familiar home at Silverwater. For a few weeks, Luke was taken daily to the campus primary school, spent the time playing on the floor of a classroom while a teacher kept an eye on him. Then a housekeeper was briefly employed to care for him. living in a downstairs room at their home. Finally, a fine Christian woman named Ivy Harker began assisting and became very attached to Luke. One time when Des was visiting Gwen, John Brinsmead said to him, "If you cast in your lot with the Brinsmead family, accepting our teachings, then God will heal Gwen." Des was appalled at the bribe. He regarded the Brinsmeads as friends, but was not prepared to compromise his conscience by joining the Awakeners. My father one time said to me, have you ever considered that if you accept Jesus, he might heal you? So my father was willing to try the same technique that he was appalled by, and others tried it on him. What did, let's skip the theology. Part of Gwen's treatment involved the drinking of large quantities of carrot juice and herbal mixtures as a cleansing regimen. Des sent her books to read in addition to dried figs, nuts, sesame seeds, and olives to supplement her diet. His prolific letters exuded a positive balm. "It is so good to know of your upward soaring," he penned. He encouraged her to take a dip in the ocean whenever she found strength. "The massage of the water and the sunshine should hasten your progress." His optimistic stimulus was constant. "Soon you will be able to see the clearing. I feel sure you're almost out of the woods now, though the building up will take some time. Your faith and love are precious. God keep you in good spirits hour by hour. Look no further than the blessings and provisions of the present moment." So when I was very sick for 6 years, and often in childhood, my father was similarly encouraging. And when my sister was struggling to get through law school, he was always constantly lifting her up and inspiring her. It's from my father's letters to my mother. "Good reading will add to your vitality. The mind energizes every cell in the body or depresses it according to our thoughts. You are rebuilding your Rome, so don't expect all in one day. I am proud of your courage, dear. But a brief part of your experience might have finished me. May he continue to sustain you. Just rest in him. When you can't pray or read, he understands and cares." Gwen was further buoyed by the arrival of her book, recently published in America, of a collection of stories for children. I read from that book last show. "This book will live on in many homes in many countries," Des affirmed, "and with his blessing will accomplish much good." She was also cheered by the baptism of her mother. Despite her illness, Gwen had endured the round trip to briefly visit her parents for the joyous occasion. So I think all my grandparents died around age 87. My mother died shortly before her 40th birthday, and my father died at age 90. Paul returned to Des about the same time. April and Des kept Gwen informed of their many hours together, gardening and playing cricket and ping pong. Paul loved fishing in the lake. He scribbled to Gwen in his best elementary hand, "Dear mother, I hope you are feeling well. On Sunday, Stuart came out. We caught 6 extra big whiting and about 20 others. How is Luke settling in? Does Luke go fishing with your papa?" So I was never into fishing. My brother's the only one in the family into fishing. This letter, this is so much like my brother. "How is Luke settling in? Does Luke go fishing with papa?" It's also filled with misspellings because my brother didn't get much education, as my parents mistakenly kept him out of school until he was about age 10. Len, too, shared her delights with Gwen. On a telegram form in the post office one day, she scratched a quick note, "Dear Mummy, I'm in Newcastle now, and Daddy has bought me a purse and shoes and socks to go with the dress you bought me, and a jumper with diamond shapes, all different colors, and a skirt, ribbons, and stockings. Love it, Len." Yes, that sounds very much like my sister. Expenditure for new clothes like this was rare. Des had written to Gwen saying he was about to take the trip to Newcastle and quipped, "I hope someone leaves us a bequest first." So my father was never much into shopping, but my sister certainly loved it. Okay, this is Jerry Wise talking. It's never too late to have a happy childhood.
Again, one of our sub-personalities, the inner child. Learning to provide healthy parenting now for our wounded inner child now is the way to have a happy childhood now. You wish you would not have had a parent who was alcoholic or who was mean or abusive, or uh, and and then treat your inner child now like you would have liked to have been treated then. That's having a new childhood. I'm going to be a new parent for me now. I'm not going to be the parent my parents were. I'm going to be a new parent for me and a healthy, good parent for myself. Listen to yourself, have empathy for yourself, love yourself, explore yourself, give to yourself, protect yourself, comfort yourself, and heal yourself. Those are all responsibilities that we have as adults for ourselves. And often we look to other people to fill those when really those are our responsibilities. So as adults, we have been called to comfort and care for ourselves.
My therapist would often encourage me to be a good friend to myself. And I didn't really know what to do with that. But I think years of therapy helped me reduce the animosity of my self-talk. I remember from years about 2006 to 2009, the most frequent thing I'd say to myself is, I'm effed. I'm so effed. I'm an effer. I'm effed up. That was typical of my self-talk. Then I think there was one Friday afternoon in 2010 when I got done with my Alexander Technique training and said, I'm just going to go home and be gentle with myself. So it's the first time I've ever spoken that way, but learning to be a good friend to yourself has been an important part of my life journey. I get on my knees every morning and ask God to help me to treat myself, help me treat other people with love and compassion. I used to think, oh, I should be hard on myself and generous with other people, but I noticed that the way I treat myself has a profound effect on how I treat other people. So being shockingly hard on myself has not done me or anyone else any benefits. The stockings went against Des's inclinations. It was silly, he felt, for a 12-year-old girl to wear such unnecessary frills. But Gwen's feminine instinct had given permission, and Des was in no frame of mind to argue matters of dress. So remember, my father and my sister were always arguing over what's appropriate dress. I mean, even when my sister was, I think, 30 years of age. This was around the time when the College Dean of Women had asked Des to speak to the resident young ladies to try to persuade them against fashion fads. So Seventh-day Adventists tend to be very modest. Seventh-day Adventist women tend to be demure. They're against ostentatious display. He was quite conservative in these matters, but would have rather spoken on any other subject. He was feeling dyspeptic at the time, but lightheartedly wrote to Gwen, poor sermons are the result of indigestion. He jested that if his nausea did not pass, he might preach so poorly that the ladies would be doomed to spinsterhood, clad in carpet bags, bags for hags. Len was at the age where she was enthusiastically involved in school swimming carnivals and Pathfinder campouts. So the Pathfinders was a youth program for Seventh-day Adventists akin to Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. She made a long list of things to take on one outing, including rice bubbles and sweets. Des reported to Gwen, she is a well-organized little miss, even though possessing many residual Gentile tastes. So candy was strictly limited in our home. After returning from one trip to Browns Falls, Alen wrote to Gwen excitedly, describing the long trek, stories around the campfire, water fights, and a midnight snack. Des was overwhelmed at times by her zest. She can talk as Vesuvius can bubble, he commented. So both my sister and I are enthusiasts. We both tend to get very excited about things for days, weeks, months, or even years on end, and then often drop them and move on to something else that just makes us incredibly excited. Yeah, residual Gentile taste equals air supply. Trying to cope on his own with a blossoming teenager had its testing moments. I have read Alen the Riot Act, Des despaired. Next will come the riot. She tried every slick trick in the book. On one occasion, when she was sick with a cold and wanted to watch a comedy on TV at a neighbor's home, she put it to Des that laughter is the best medicine and it might cure my cold. So did anybody in my family serve in World War I or World War II? My father's brother served in World War II. He fought in Papua New Guinea. And I believe my mother's father fought in World War I. And that's all I can recollect. I did have relatives who came back from World War I, like permanently damaged, perhaps at Gallipoli. Des's domestic pressures were compounded by serious troubles in the theology department. One lecturer was recommending that students read Bertrand Russell's Why I'm Not a Christian. Now, Des was counseling one lad who had become an agnostic as a result of reading it. Another lecturer was in hot water for advocating a raft of personal opinions that unsettled the students. He lasted 6 months until dismissal. Des found it hard to sleep at night because of the turmoil and suffered stomach pains. He was given free access to a guest room in the men's dormitories to rest between classes and wondered to himself if he should become a postman to avoid all the stress. Will I fight in World War III? I'm fighting World War III right now, my friend. Des's mind was continually on Gwen. Tragically, the natural remedies only brought temporary relief for her. The cancer invaded her bones, so many hopes were dashed. In July, she returned to Silverwater, emaciated and hardly able to walk. Gwen was in constant pain, but never complained. She used to say it was Des's love that kept her alive. A cordotomy was tried as a means of reducing her pain. That's some surgery to do with the spine. It was unsuccessful, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down and still in pain. She wasted away, weighing only a Belson-like 60 pounds. She was about 5'2". Home care became impractical and inadequate. She was therefore admitted to nearby Erling Nursing Home, a private facility run by a church member. A friend of mine's wife worked at that nursing home and cared for my mother. She said her goodbyes to Luke. He was taken to New Zealand in the care of Ivy Harker. So I have very few memories of my mother. I don't think I ever saw her after this time. So I have memories of her preparing scrambled eggs for me for breakfast. And for many years throughout my childhood, scrambled eggs were my favorite food. I also have a vague memory of her kind of crawling to me. I was getting a beating, I think, by my sister because I'd broken into my sister's perfume collection and smeared it with the toothpaste all over the bathroom. And my sister was beating me. And my mother crawled out of her sick bed and draped herself over me and said, "He's only a little boy. He doesn't know any better." So I can picture her. I do remember her, but very few memories. Ellen and Paul often called in after school to visit with their mother. Sometimes Des would drive Gwen and the children to the Watagan Hills, place her in a well-cushioned wheelchair, and push her for miles along the forest tracks. She enjoyed the fresh air and natural landscape. When those outings became too strenuous, she would be brought home in the car on Sabbath and Sunday afternoons. Des and Paul gently lifted her in and out of the vehicle to minimize her pain. Toward the end, her spinal column could not bear any weight at all, and she had to remain lying in a stretcher position. Gwen bravely faced her inevitable demise. She wrote of her confidence in the Lord. This touching testimony was published in the church journal. I read it last week. Like any mother wanting the best for her brood, she talked with Des about prospects of a remarriage after she was gone. Both Des and Gwen were aware that some women had been making a play for Des's attention. As early as 2 years prior to her death, he deliberately shunned any hint of an advance. Gwen went ahead and thoughtfully made a list of those women close to them whom she believed were most suitable to assume her role after her death. Witnessing Gwen racked with pain wasting away before his eyes, Des had to wrestle with the choice of allowing palliative drugs that reduced pain but invariably hastened death. Gwen lay dying. He aired the ethics of this form of euthanasia with his closest confidant, Norman Young, then a student at Manchester University. Young was too upset and recoiled from the sad news, only managing to answer, "Do not feel free to write on mercy, termination of life while in your present trials." On April 22nd, 1970, Gwen turned 40. Jill Wastel, Gillian, an assistant at the nursing home who bonded with Gwen, had taken Ellen and Paul to stay with friends on an isolated farm near Wachapapee, leaving Des by Gwen's bedside. She drifted into a coma-like state. So she had turned 40. So April 24, 1970, as the Sabbath began on Friday evening, she roused, gently pressed Des' hand, and said, "Thank you for a lovely life," and went to her rest peacefully. Wow, what a way to go. Like you touch your spouse's hand and say, "Thank you for a lovely life." Word was sent to Gillian that she should call Des. She took Ellen and drove in the night to a telephone where they received the sad news. By the time they returned, Paul was asleep. The next morning, Ellen recalls, "I remember Paul's sad, lonely figure sitting outside on a bench. He knew something bad had happened, but was just sitting there waiting to be told. I was told to go and tell him. I sat down next to him, and he asked if Mother had died. I angrily replied, of course." Both Ellen and Paul developed tough exteriors to hide their pain. They, with Des, had known for a long time that the evil day would come. Luke, barely 4 years old, did not understand the enormity of the situation. The bitterness of any theological debate was mild compared to the sinking grief experienced by the family. Gwen's funeral service was conducted by Archibald Heffron, at the time a fellow lecturer with Des. She lives in God's Acre, the college campus cemetery, until the resurrection. Norman Young wrote, "When the writer of Hebrews 11 ran out of time to name more examples of faith, he left the way open for later generations to include the likes of Gwen." That's the end of chapter 5. Back to beloved Avondale. Okay, I think that's a good place to end for today. Bye-bye.